Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is forget your place and follow your heart. In 1887, Clara knew that as a black maid in Millfield, Montana Territory, she was supposed to keep quiet and mind her own business. But when she heard a little boy crying for help outside a locked house, everything changed. The child was no more than 8 years old, beating on the door with his tiny fists. "Please help me. My mom is inside and she won't wake up," he screamed. Clara's hands shook as she tried the door handle. It was locked tight from the inside. The silence from within the house made her stomach turn. Something was very wrong. When she finally broke through that door, what she found would shake her to her core. The boy's mother lay unconscious and tied up. But this was just the beginning of a terrible secret that would put both Clara and the child in deadly danger. But who in this quiet town could they trust when the very people meant to protect them might be behind it all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Washington had learned long ago that survival meant knowing your place. At 24, she moved through the dusty streets of Millfield with the quiet grace of someone who understood that being seen too much could be dangerous. Her calloused hands carried the worn prayer book that had belonged to her mother, the only thing she had left from a life that seemed like someone else's dream. The leather binding was cracked and faded, its pages yellowed from years of desperate prayers whispered in the darkness of cramped quarters. Inside the front cover, her mother's careful handwriting still remained. "For my Clara, may you find strength in His word when the world tries to break you." Clara traced those words every morning before dawn, drawing courage from her mother's faith before facing another day in a world that saw her as less than human. Millfield sat nestled in a valley surrounded by the rugged peaks of the Montana Territory, a place where fortunes were made and lost with each strike of a pickaxe. The town had grown from a scattered collection of tents and shacks to a proper settlement of nearly 2,000 souls, complete with wooden sidewalks, a railroad depot, and 3 churches that preached different versions of the same salvation. But beneath its veneer of civilization, old prejudices ran as deep as the mine shafts that honeycombed the surrounding mountains. The wealthy families lived in grand houses on the hill overlooking the town, their manicured gardens and painted fences a stark contrast to the shanties where the miners and their families crowded together. Clara worked for 3 of these families, moving between their homes like a ghost, cleaning their chambers, washing their linens, and listening to their secrets without seeming to hear. Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore was Clara's primary employer, a stern woman in her 50s who ran her household with military precision. The Whitmore mansion stood as one of the finest homes in Millfield, built with money from Mr. Whitmore's silver mine and furnished with pieces shipped from San Francisco. Mrs. Whitmore demanded excellence in all things, from the way Clara arranged the flowers in the parlor to the exact temperature of the bath water she drew each evening. "Clara," Mrs. Whitmore would say in her clipped Eastern accent, "remember that a house reflects the character of its inhabitants. Disorder in the home leads to chaos in the soul." Clara would nod respectfully, understanding that Mrs. Whitmore's need for control came from her own fears about their precarious position in society. For all their wealth, the Whitmores were still considered newcomers by the established families, still fighting for acceptance in a town where bloodlines mattered as much as bank accounts. Sheriff Morrison was another figure Clara encountered regularly in her work, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and eyes that never seemed to rest. He made his rounds through the wealthy neighborhoods with the confidence of someone who knew his authority was absolute. He would tip his hat to Clara when their paths crossed, a gesture that seemed polite on the surface but carried an undertone of condescension that made her skin crawl. "Morning, Clara," he would say, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of someone from the deep South. "Mrs. Whitmore keeping you?" "Busy, I expect." Clara would respond with the expected deference, but something in Morrison's manner always made her uncomfortable. Perhaps it was the way his eyes lingered too long, or the slight smile that never quite reached his eyes. Dr. Ezra Blackwell represented the closest thing Millfield had to an intellectual. A graduate of a medical college back east, he had come west seeking adventure and stayed for the steady income that came from tending to the ailments of wealthy miners and their families. His office occupied the ground floor of a neat two-story building on Main Street, and Clara cleaned it twice a week, carefully dusting his medical instruments and organizing his papers with the same attention to detail she brought to all her work. Dr. Blackwell treated Clara with professional courtesy, neither overly familiar nor deliberately distant. He was a man who seemed to live in his own world of medical journals and scientific principles, removed from the petty prejudices that governed so much of daily life in Millfield. Clara respected him for that, even as she sensed a loneliness in the way he buried himself in his work. The Henderson family occupied a middle position in Millfield's social hierarchy. Robert Henderson owned a smaller mine that produced steady, if not spectacular, returns, and his wife Elizabeth was known for her involvement in charitable works. Their son Tommy was 8 years old, a bright child with serious eyes, who often watched the adults around him with an intensity that suggested he understood more than anyone realized. Clara had cleaned the Henderson house only a few times, filling in when a regular girl was ill, but she had always found Mrs. Henderson to be kind without being condescending. Elizabeth Henderson spoke to Clara as one human being to another, asking about her health and commenting on the weather without the artificial cheerfulness that many white women adopted when addressing their servants. Clara's own living situation reflected her position in the town's social order. She rented a small room in the back of Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, a weathered structure that catered to the town's working class. The room was barely large enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small trunk that held her few possessions. But it was clean and private, and Mrs. Patterson, a widow who had learned to see people for who they were rather than what they looked like, treated her tenants fairly. The black community in Millfield was small but close-knit. Most were former slaves who had come west seeking freedom and opportunity, though they had found that prejudice traveled as easily as hope. They looked out for each other, sharing information about work opportunities and warning of potential dangers. Clara attended services at the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a modest building that served as both spiritual and community center for the dozen black families in town. Reverend Joshua Williams led the congregation with a quiet strength that came from years of fighting battles with prayer instead of violence. He was a man in his 60s who had been born into slavery and had learned to read in secret before emancipation. His sermons wove together biblical wisdom with practical advice about surviving in a hostile world, always emphasizing the importance of dignity and mutual support. "We may not be able to control how others see us," he would say from his simple wooden pulpit, "but we can control how we see ourselves. Never let anyone convince you that you are less than a child of God." Clara drew strength from these words, carrying them with her into the grand houses where she was expected to be invisible. The work itself was demanding but familiar. Clara rose before dawn, said her prayers with her mother's book, and prepared for another day of cleaning, cooking, and tending to the needs of families who barely acknowledged her existence. She took pride in her work, understanding that excellence was its own form of resistance. When Mrs. Whitmore's parlor gleamed and her linens were pressed to perfection, Clara knew she had proven something to herself, if not to the world. But lately, there had been whispers in the community that troubled her. 3 women in the past year had suffered what the town paper called accidents, falls downstairs, kicks from horses, mysterious illnesses that left them bedridden for weeks. Each incident had been explained away, but Clara had noticed a pattern. That made her uneasy. All three women had been wives of successful men, and all three had recovered with a new willingness to defer to their husbands' business decisions. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Clara had finished her early duties at the Whitmore house and was walking toward Dr. Blackwell's office when she heard the sound that would haunt her dreams, a child's voice, high and desperate, calling for help with the kind of panic that cuts through all social conventions. Tommy Henderson stood outside his family's house, his small fists pounding against the locked door as tears streamed down his face. The sight of his distress pierced Clara's heart, reminding her of her own childhood fears and the adults who had sometimes failed to protect her when she needed them most. "Please help me. My mama's inside and she won't wake up." The words tumbled out between sobs, and Clara felt her carefully constructed world of rules and boundaries crumble. This was a child in need, and everything she had been taught about knowing her place suddenly seemed less important than doing what was right. As Clara approached the house, her mother's prayer book seemed to grow heavier in her pocket, as if reminding her of the strength that had carried her family through generations of hardship. She didn't know what she would find behind that locked door, but she knew she couldn't walk away from a child's cry for help. The door was solid oak, locked from the inside with a heavy brass mechanism that seemed designed to keep the world out rather than simply secure the house. Clara's hands trembled as she examined the lock, her mind racing through possibilities. Tawny's continued sobbing urged her forward, past the voice in her head that warned her to fetch the sheriff, past the knowledge that breaking into a white family's home could mean jail or worse. Using a hairpin and the kind of determination born from desperation, Clara worked at the lock until she heard the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. The door swung open to reveal a scene that would forever change her understanding of the darkness that lurked beneath Millfield's civilized facade. The silence that greeted Clara as she stepped across the threshold was more terrifying than any scream could have been. The Henderson house, usually filled with the comfortable sounds of family life, felt hollow and wrong, as if something evil had sucked the warmth from its walls. Tommy rushed past her, his small feet pattering against the polished wooden floors as he led her toward the back of the house. "She's in here," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of Clara's racing heart. "I tried to wake her up, but she won't move, and there's something wrong with her dress." Clara followed the boy down the familiar hallway, her trained eye automatically noting details that seemed somehow significant in the strange quiet of the house. A vase of flowers had been knocked over, leaving water stains on the mahogany side table. The family portrait that usually hung straight was tilted at an odd angle. Most disturbing of all, the heavy drapes in the parlor had been drawn tight, blocking out the morning sunlight and creating an atmosphere of unnatural gloom. Mrs. Henderson lay on the sitting room floor, her usually neat hair disheveled and her day dress torn at the shoulder in a way that spoke of violence rather than accident. Her face was pale but peaceful, as if she were simply sleeping, but the rope marks around her wrists told a different story. Clara knelt beside her, pressing her ear to the woman's chest and feeling the relief flood through her as she detected a steady, if weak, heartbeat. "Thank God," Clara whispered, her hands moving with practiced efficiency to check for injuries. "Tommy, can you fetch me some water from the kitchen? And a clean cloth." The boy nodded eagerly, grateful to have something useful to do. As his footsteps faded toward the kitchen, Clara took the opportunity to examine the scene more carefully. Mrs. Henderson's torn dress was made of expensive silk, the kind that didn't tear easily. The fabric around the shoulder showed deliberate cuts, as if someone had used a knife to slice through the material. More disturbing still, Clara noticed that Mrs. Henderson's wedding ring was missing from her finger, though the pale band of skin beneath showed it had been there recently. The sitting room itself told a story of struggle and careful staging. Furniture had been moved slightly out of place, not knocked over dramatically, but repositioned with an attention to detail that suggested the attacker had taken time to arrange things just so. A tea service sat on the side table, 2 cups and saucers arranged as if for a social visit, though one cup showed traces of a residue that Clara didn't recognize. Tommy returned with the water and cloth, his young face etched with worry. Is she going to be all right? She was making funny noises when I found her, like she was trying to say something but couldn't get the words out. Clara dipped a cloth in the cool water and began gently cleaning Mrs. Henderson's face, hoping the sensation might help bring her around. What did you hear her trying to say? Tommy, can you remember? The boy scrunched his face in concentration, clearly struggling with memories that frightened him. It sounded like she was saying a name, but it was all mixed up. Like more or more something, and she kept trying to point at the door. Clara's blood chilled at the boy's words. Morrison was a common enough name, but in their small town, it could only mean one person. Sheriff Morrison, the man they would normally turn to for help in a situation like this. If Mrs. Henderson had been trying to warn them about the sheriff, then they were in more danger than Clara had realized. Tommy, Clara said carefully, not wanting to frighten the child more than necessary. I need you to think hard about this morning. When you woke up, was your father here? No, ma'am. Papa left real early to check on the mine. He does that sometimes when there's been blasting. Mama was making breakfast, and she seemed happy, humming that song she likes. Tommy's eyes filled with tears again. Then I heard her scream, and when I came running, the door was locked and she wouldn't answer me. Clara processed this information while continuing to tend to Mrs. Henderson. The timing suggested the attack had been carefully planned, with the attacker knowing that Mr. Henderson would be away from the house. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. Someone had been watching the family, learning their routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike dot as she worked. Clara became aware of small details that reinforced her growing suspicion that this attack was part of something larger. Mrs. Henderson's jewelry box sat open on the dresser, but only certain pieces were missing valuable items that could be easily sold, but also items with sentimental value that wouldn't be taken by a simple thief. The selection suggested someone who knew the family well enough to understand which pieces mattered most. A soft moan from Mrs. Henderson drew Clara's attention back to her patient. The woman's eyelids fluttered, and she seemed to be struggling toward consciousness. Clara leaned closer, speaking in the soothing tone she had learned from years of caring for others. Mrs. Henderson, can you hear me? You're safe now. Tommy is here, and he's just fine. Elizabeth Henderson's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, but gradually sharpening as awareness returned. When she saw Clara bending over her, relief flooded her features, followed quickly by fear. Clara, she whispered, her voice hoarse and strained. Thank God you came. I tried to call for help, but She stopped suddenly, her eyes darting toward Tommy with the protective instinct of a mother who didn't want to frighten her child with details of her ordeal. It's all right, Clara said gently. Tommy told me you were trying to say something. Was it about who did this to you? Mrs. Henderson's face went pale, and she glanced again at her son before speaking in a voice so low that Clara had to lean close to hear. Not here, not with Tommy listening. But Clara, you have to be careful. This isn't what it seems. There are people in this town? She broke off as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the front porch. Heavy boots on wooden steps, the confident stride of someone who belonged here. Clara's heart hammered as she recognized the familiar pattern of Sheriff Morrison's walk. Tommy started toward the front door, eager to tell the sheriff about his mother's condition. But Mrs. Henderson grabbed Clara's wrist with surprising strength. Don't let him take me away from here, she whispered urgently. Promise me, Clara. Whatever he says, don't let him separate me from Tommy. The desperation in Mrs. Henderson's voice sent ice through Clara's veins. She looked into the woman's Eisen saw the kind of fear that came from knowing exactly who was dangerous, not the abstract fear of unknown threats, but the specific terror of recognizing evil in a familiar face. "I promise," Clara said, though she had no idea how she could keep such a vow against the authority of the law. Sheriff Morrison's knock echoed through the house, followed by his voice calling out in tones of official concern. "Mrs. Henderson? Tommy? I got word there might be some trouble here." Clara helped Mrs. Henderson sit up, noting how the woman's hands shook as she tried to smooth her torn dress and restore some semblance of dignity to her appearance. The careful way she moved suggested injuries that went beyond what Clara could see, and the haunted expression in her eyes spoke of violations that might never fully heal. "Remember," Mrs. Henderson whispered as Tommy ran to answer the door, "not all the people who are supposed to protect us actually do." The front door opened with a creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere of the house. Sheriff Morrison's voice carried down the hallway, friendly and concerned, playing his role to perfection. "Well, hello there, Tommy. I heard there might be some trouble here this morning. Is your mother all right?" Clara listened to the sheriff's words and heard something that chilled her more than obvious threats would have the tone of a man who already knew exactly what he would find, who was asking questions he already knew the answers to. This was not the voice of someone responding to an emergency, but of an actor delivering lines in a play where the ending had already been written down as Morrison's footsteps approached the sitting room. Clara made a decision that would change the course of her life. Instead of stepping back into the shadows, as she had been trained to do, she positioned herself between Mrs. Henderson and the doorway, her mother's prayer book a small but comforting weight in her pocket. Whatever was happening in Millfield, whatever evil had taken root in their quiet town, Clara Washington was no longer content to be invisible. Sheriff Morrison filled the doorway like a storm cloud, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere in the small sitting room. He was a large man, made larger by the authority of his badge and the gun that hung at his hip. His gray eyes swept the scene with the kind of professional assessment that suggested he had dealt with similar situations before. "Well now," he said, his voice carrying that deceptively lazy southern drawl, "looks like we've had ourselves some excitement here." His gaze settled on Clara with barely concealed irritation. "Clara, isn't it? What exactly are you doing here?" Clara felt the weight of generations of training telling her to lower her eyes, apologize for her presence, and step aside for her betters. But Mrs. Henderson's whispered plea echoed in her ears, and she found strength she didn't know she possessed. "Tommy called for help, Sheriff. I heard him crying and came to see what was wrong." Clara kept her voice respectful but firm. "Mrs. Henderson appears to have been attacked. She needs medical attention." Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly, and Clara caught something that made her stomach clench, a flash of annoyance that suggested her presence was complicating his plans. He moved closer to examine Mrs. Henderson, but Clara noticed that his attention seemed focused more on assessing what she might have told Clara than on evaluating her injuries. "Elizabeth," Morrison said, his tone shifting to one of paternal concern, "can you tell me what happened here? Did you get a look at whoever did this to you?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes met Clara's for just a moment before she answered, and Clara saw the careful calculation in her expression. Everything happened so fast. "Sheriff, I remember someone at the door, and then—" She gestured weakly at her torn dress and disheveled appearance. "The next thing I knew, Clara was helping me." Morrison nodded as if this were exactly the answer he had expected. "Probably some drifter passing through. We've had reports of suspicious characters in the area lately." He paused, letting his gaze settle meaningfully on Clara. "Of course, we'll need to investigate thoroughly. Make sure we get all the facts straight." The threat in his words was subtle but unmistakable. Clara understood that he was warning her to keep her observations to herself, but she also noticed that he hadn't asked about the missing jewelry or the peculiar staging of the crime scene. A real investigation would have included those details. But Morrison seemed eager to wrap this up with the minimum of actual detecting. "I should fetch Dr. Blackwell," Clara said, testing the waters. "Mrs. Henderson should be examined properly." "Already sent word," Morrison replied quickly. "He should be here shortly." Another lie, Clara realized. She had seen no messenger leaving the area, and Morrison had arrived too quickly to have received word through normal channels. He had come here, knowing what he would find. Tommy had been sitting quietly beside his mother, but now he spoke up, with the earnestness of childhood. "Sheriff Morrison, Mama was trying to say something when I found her." It sounded like a name. "Now, Tommy," Morrison interrupted with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sometimes when people are hurt, they make sounds that might seem like words, but don't really mean anything. "Your mama was probably just confused." Clara watched this exchange with growing alarm. Morrison was actively discouraging the boy from sharing what he had heard, which suggested that Tommy's information might be dangerous to someone. The sheriff's eagerness to control the narrative was becoming more obvious with each passing moment. When Dr. Blackwell finally arrived, Clara noted that he seemed surprised to see Morrison already there. The doctor was a precise man who approached his work with scientific rigor, and Clara hoped his medical training might reveal details that could help Mrs. Henderson's case. "Sheriff," Dr. Blackwell said with professional courtesy before turning his attention to his patient. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to examine you now. Can you tell me where you're experiencing pain?" As the doctor worked, Clara watched Morrison watching the examination. The sheriff's interest seemed focused less on Mrs. Henderson's welfare and more on what the doctor might discover. When Dr. Blackwell found the rope marks on her wrists, Morrison was quick to offer an explanation. "Looks like whoever did this tied her up," he said matter-of-factly. "Common enough tactic with these drifters. Tie up their victims while they search the house." Dr. Blackwell nodded absently, but Clara noticed that he seemed troubled by something about the marks. The doctor's examination was thorough and gentle, and Clara found herself hoping that his scientific approach might reveal clues that could help identify Mrs. Henderson's real attacker. After Morrison and Dr. Blackwell left Morrison promising to increase patrols in the area, and Dr. Blackwell leaving instructions for Mrs. Henderson's care, Clara found herself alone with the Henderson family. Tommy had been sent to play in his room while the adults talked, giving Clara her first opportunity to speak privately with Mrs. Henderson. "You know who did this," Clara said quietly. It wasn't a question that Mrs. Henderson's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down her face. "I can't prove anything. Who would believe me? Who would believe us against him?" Clara understood the hopelessness in the woman's voice, but she also felt a growing determination that surprised her. "Tell me what happened. All of it." For the next hour, Mrs. Henderson shared details that painted a picture far more complex and terrifying than a simple robbery. The attack had indeed been carefully planned, timed to coincide with her husband's absence. The attacker had known details about the family's routines that could only have come from someone with regular access to such information. More disturbing still, Mrs. Henderson revealed that she wasn't the first. Over the past year, she had noticed a pattern among the wives of successful businessmen in town. Women who had once been confident and outspoken had become withdrawn and deferential after experiencing what were publicly described as accidents or illnesses. "Sarah Winters fell down her stairs last spring," Mrs. Henderson whispered. "But Sarah was the most careful woman I knew. She would never have been careless on those steps." And afterward, she shuddered. Afterward, she agreed to let her husband sell their land to some investment group from back east. Land she had sworn she'd never part with. Clara listened with growing understanding. The attacks weren't random violence. They were tools of coercion, designed to break the will of women who might otherwise resist their husbands' business decisions. Someone was systematically terrorizing the wives of Millfield's most successful men, and that someone had the protection of the law. As Clara prepared to leave the Henderson house, Mrs. Henderson caught her hand. "There's something else," she said, glancing toward the stairs to ensure Tommy was still in his room. "In my bedroom, in the bottom drawer of my dresser, there's a hidden compartment. I kept some letters there. Personal correspondence. If they're still there, they might help you understand what's really happening in this town." Clara nodded, understanding that she was being entrusted with more than just hidden letters. Mrs. Henderson was asking her to become an investigator, to dig into secrets that powerful people had killed to protect. It was a dangerous request, one that could cost Clara everything she had worked to build. But as she looked at Mrs. Henderson's bruised face and thought about Tommy's terror at finding his mother unconscious, Clara knew she couldn't walk away. Someone had to stand up for the people who couldn't protect themselves, and if that someone had to be a black maid with no official authority, then so be it. "I'll be careful," Clara promised, "but I won't let them get away with this." That evening, Clara returned to the Henderson house under cover of darkness. Tommy let her in through the kitchen door, his young face serious with the weight of shared secrets. Mrs. Henderson was resting, but she had made sure Tommy knew where to find the hidden letters. The compartment was skillfully concealed beneath the drawer's false bottom, and Clara's heart raced as she carefully removed the bundle of correspondence. Even in the dim light of Tommy's small candle, she could see that these were love letters, passionate, intimate communications that would have been scandalous if made public. But as Clara read through the letters, by candlelight in her small room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, she realized that scandal was the least of their concerns. The letters revealed an affair between Mrs. Henderson and someone identified only by the initial Maid, someone who had access to inside information about mining claims and business deals, someone who knew which families were most vulnerable to financial pressure. The final letter in the bundle was different from the others, shorter, colder, and clearly written by someone who had grown tired of romantic entanglements. It was a breakup letter, one that carried undertones of threat disguised as regret. The writer had made it clear that their relationship was over, and that any attempt to make their affair public would result in consequences that Mrs. Henderson wouldn't like. Clara stared at that final letter until her candle burned low, understanding finally that she was looking at a motive for the attack on Mrs. Henderson. Someone had used romance as a weapon, gathering information and leverage that could be used to control and manipulate. When Mrs. Henderson had presumably become difficult to manage, violence had replaced seduction as the preferred tool of control. The realization that settled over Clara as she prepared for bed was both terrifying and liberating. She was no longer investigating a simple assault. She was uncovering a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Millfield society. And somewhere in this quiet frontier town, a predator was stalking his next victim. Confident that his position would protect him from any consequences, Clara tucked her mother's prayer book under her pillow and whispered a prayer for strength and wisdom. Tomorrow, she would begin the dangerous work of gathering evidence against someone powerful enough to make her disappear without a trace. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel something she had never experienced before. The fierce determination came from knowing she was fighting for something more important than her own safety. The next morning brought no comfort to Clara's troubled sleep. She rose before dawn, as always, but instead of her usual prayers, she found herself studying the love letters by lamplight, searching for clues she might have missed in her first reading. The handwriting was educated, confident, with the kind of flourishes that suggested someone accustomed to authority and respect. More telling were the details scattered throughout the correspondence, references to city council meetings, mining rights discussions, and business deals that hadn't yet become public knowledge. The mysterious M was clearly someone with access to confidential information, someone who moved in the highest circles of Millfield society. Clara's duties at Dr. Blackwell's office that morning took on new significance as she realized that his medical records might contain evidence of the pattern Mrs. Henderson had described. As she dusted the doctor's filing cabinets and organized his papers, Clara kept her eyes open for anything that might confirm her growing suspicions. Dr. Blackwell was a meticulous record keeper, and his files contained detailed notes on every patient he had treated over the past 5 years. Working quietly while the doctor made his morning rounds, Clara systematically reviewed the records of the town's most prominent families, looking for the pattern of suspicious injuries Mrs. Henderson had mentioned. What she found made her blood run cold. Sarah Winters, the woman who had supposedly fallen down her stairs, had been treated for injuries that Dr. Blackwell's careful notes suggested were inconsistent with a simple fall. The bruising patterns and the nature of her fractures pointed to deliberate violence rather than accidental injury. Yet the official report filed with the sheriff's office described it as a household accident. Margaret Cromwell, the banker's wife, had been treated for what Dr. Blackwell had diagnosed as acute stress response, a condition he noted was typically seen in victims of severe trauma. Her husband had explained her condition as the result of a riding accident, but the doctor's private notes questioned this explanation, particularly given the absence of any external injuries consistent with being thrown from a horse. The most disturbing case was that of Helen Morrison, the sheriff's own wife. Dr. Blackwell's records showed that she had been treated multiple times over the past 2 years for injuries that he had carefully documented as inconsistent with reported causes. The doctor's notes revealed a pattern of escalating violence, but there was no indication that he had ever reported his suspicions to any authority. Clara realized with growing horror that Dr. Blackwell knew exactly what was happening to these women, but his position as a professional bound by patient confidentiality had prevented him from speaking out. The evidence was there in his careful documentation, but it was locked away in medical files that would never be made public unless someone forced the issue. As Clara continued her cleaning, she became aware that Dr. Blackwell was watching her more carefully than usual. When he returned to his office around midday, he closed the door behind him and turned to face her with an expression that mixed concern with determination. "Clara," he said quietly, "I couldn't help but notice that you've been paying particular attention to certain files this morning. Is there something specific you're looking for?" Clara felt her heart leap into her throat, but something in the doctor's manner suggested that this might be an opportunity rather than a threat. Dr. Blackwell had always treated her with respect, and his medical records showed that he had been documenting evidence of abuse even when he couldn't act on it. "Doctor," Clara said carefully, "what would you say if I told you that Mrs. Henderson's attack yesterday wasn't the work of some random drifter?" Dr. Blackwell was quiet for a long moment, studying Clara's face with the same intensity he brought to diagnosing his patients. Finally, he sighed and moved to his desk, pulling out a leather-bound journal that Clara had never seen before. "I would say," he replied slowly, "that you've reached the same conclusion I've been struggling with for the past 2 years. He opened the journal to reveal pages of careful notes, dates, and observations. "This is my private record of cases that have troubled me, cases where the official explanations don't match the medical evidence." Clara moved closer, hardly daring to believe that she had found an ally in such an unexpected place. Dr. Blackwell's journal contained detailed analysis of each suspicious case, complete with sketches of injury patterns and notes about the victim's behavior during treatment. "Why haven't you taken this to the authorities?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because the authorities are part of the problem," Dr. Blackwell said grimly. "I've tried dropping hints, suggesting that certain cases deserved more investigation, but I've been consistently discouraged from pursuing the matter. Sheriff Morrison has made it clear that he considers these cases closed. and Judge Hartwell has indicated that any attempt to publicly question the official findings would be viewed as professional misconduct. Clara felt the pieces of the conspiracy clicking into place. It wasn't just Morrison acting alone. This was a coordinated effort involving multiple people in positions of authority. The question was whether Dr. Blackwell was prepared to risk his career to help stop it. "What if I told you," Clara said carefully, "that I might be able to prove who's responsible? Would you be willing to help, even if it meant going against people who could destroy your practice?" Dr. Blackwell closed his journal and looked at Clara with newfound respect. "Clara, if you have evidence that could stop these attacks, then I'll do whatever I can to help. These women deserve justice, and I've been a coward for too long." That afternoon, Clara made her way to the livery stable, where she had arranged to meet Marcus Thompson, a freed slave who had become the town's most skilled blacksmith. Marcus was a quiet man in his 30s who had learned to navigate the complexities of frontier racial politics with careful diplomacy. But Clara had sensed in their previous conversations that his calm exterior concealed a sharp intelligence and a deep anger about injustice. She found Marcus working on a horseshoe, his powerful arms moving the hot metal with practiced precision. When he saw Clara approaching, he set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his leather apron. "Clara," he said with genuine warmth, "good to see you. What brings you to my humble establishment?" Clara glanced around to ensure they were alone. Before speaking, "Marcus, I need to ask you about something that might be dangerous to discuss. Are you willing to listen?" Marcus's expression grew serious, but he nodded without hesitation. The silver pocket watch lay half hidden beneath a fallen log near the creek where Sarah Winters had supposedly been thrown from her horse 6 months earlier. Clara almost missed it, the tarnished metal barely catching the morning sunlight as bare. She searched the area where Mrs. Patterson's records indicated the accident had occurred. Clara had risen before dawn to conduct her investigation, knowing that daylight would bring too many prying eyes to her activities. The creek ran behind the Winters property, accessible through a grove of cottonwood trees that provided excellent cover for someone who didn't want to be seen. As Clara examined the ground for evidence that might have been overlooked, the watch emerged from its hiding place like an accusation waiting to be heard. The timepiece was expensive, made of solid silver with an intricate engraving on the cover, but it was the inscription on the back that made Clara's hands tremble as she held it up to the light. "To M.H. with gratitude for distinguished service, Millfield Town Council, 1885. M.H., the initials could belong to several men in town, but combined with the formal presentation and the date, Clara knew she was looking at a watch that had been given to someone in recognition of official service. Someone whose initials matched the mysterious lover who had written those passionate letters to Mrs. Henderson. Clara carefully wrapped the watch in her handkerchief and slipped it into her pocket, her mind racing with the implications of her discovery. The watch hadn't been lost recently. The tarnishing and the way it had settled into the earth suggested it had been here for months, probably since the time of Sarah Winters' attack. Someone had been careless enough to drop a valuable personal item while committing violence, and that carelessness might finally provide the evidence needed to expose the conspiracy. As Clara made her way back toward town, she became aware that she was being followed. The footsteps behind her were careful, attempting to match her pace and stay hidden among the trees. But Clara's heightened awareness picked up the subtle sounds of someone trying very hard not to be detected. She forced herself to maintain her normal walking pace, while her heart hammered against her ribs, rather than head directly back to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Clara took a circuitous route through the town's back alleys, hoping to either lose her pursuer or get a better look at who was tracking her movements. The game of cat and mouse continued for nearly 20 minutes before Clara finally ducked into the space between two buildings and waited. Her patience was rewarded when a figure emerged from the shadows, not the stranger from the hotel that Mrs. Patterson had mentioned, but Deputy Jake Collins, Sheriff Morrison's right-hand man. Collins was a young man in his 20s who had always struck Clara as more follower than leader, someone who took orders without asking too many questions. Seeing him following her suggested that Morrison was keeping closer tabs on her activities than she had realized. Clara waited until Collins had passed her hiding spot before emerging and making her way to Dr. Blackwell's office through a different route. The doctor was examining a patient when she arrived, so Clara busied herself with cleaning while her mind churned over the implications of her morning's discoveries. When the patient left and they were alone, Clara showed Dr. Blackwell the pocket watch, explaining where she had found it and what the inscription suggested. The doctor examined the timepiece carefully, turning it over in his hands as he considered its significance. "How much?" Dr. Blackwell murmured, reading the inscription. In 1885, the town council presented awards to several citizens for distinguished service. I remember the ceremony because I was asked to provide medical clearance for the recipients. He paused, his face growing troubled. One of those awards went to Marshal Hendricks. He was the law enforcement officer before Morrison took over. Clara felt her heart sink. Marshal Hendricks? But he left town over a year ago, didn't he? I thought he took a position in Colorado. That's what everyone was told, Dr. Blackwell said slowly. But Clara, if this watch belonged to Hendricks and it was found at the site of Sarah Winters' attack, then either he never left town or... The doctor stopped. The implications too disturbing to voice directly. Clara finished the thought for him. Or someone wanted it to look like he was responsible. Someone who had access to his personal belongings and could plant evidence to throw suspicion away from themselves. The realization that they might be dealing with not just corruption, but murder made Clara's discoveries feel even more dangerous. If Marshal Hendricks had been eliminated to clear the way for Morrison's appointment, then the conspiracy had already claimed at least one life. And if Clara continued digging, she might well be next. That afternoon, Clara paid a visit to Tommy Henderson under the pretext of checking on his mother's recovery. Mrs. Henderson was much improved physically, but Clara could see the haunted expression that lingered in her eyes. The trauma of her attack would take much longer to heal than her physical injuries. While Mrs. Henderson rested, Clara spoke privately with Tommy in the kitchen. The boy had been thinking about his mother's attack, and with the resilience of childhood, he had begun to remember details that had been lost in the initial shock and fear. "Miss Clara," Tommy said, his young voice serious with the weight of his revelations, "I remembered something else about that morning. Before Mama screamed, I heard her talking to someone at the front door. She sounded happy, like she knew the person." Clara felt her pulse quicken. "Could you hear what she was saying, or what the other person sounded like?" Tommy scrunched his face in concentration, clearly working hard to retrieve memories that frightened him. "Mama said something like, 'What a nice surprise,' and 'I wasn't expecting you.' And the other voice, it was a man, and he sounded like someone I should know, but I couldn't see him from upstairs." This information confirmed Clara's growing suspicion that Mrs. Henderson's attacker was someone she trusted, someone who could approach her home without arousing suspicion. The attack hadn't been the work of a stranger. It was a betrayal by someone who had used Mrs. Henderson's trust to gain access to her home. "Tommy," Clara said gently, "I need you to promise me something. If you remember anything else about that morning, or if anyone comes asking you questions about what you saw or heard, I want you to tell them you don't remember anything. Can you do that for me?" The boy nodded solemnly, understanding that there was danger in his knowledge, even if he didn't fully comprehend its source. Clara hated having to burden a child with such responsibility, but she knew that Tommy's safety depended on his ability to appear ignorant of details that could expose the conspiracy. As Clara prepared to leave the Henderson house, Mrs. Henderson called her into the sitting room where the attack had taken place. The room had been cleaned and rearranged, but Clara could still sense the violence that had occurred there. as if the walls themselves retained the memory of fear and brutality. "Clara," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've been thinking about those letters you found. About Mem and what he might be capable of." She paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say. "I think I know who he is, but I'm afraid to name him. Once I say it out loud, there's no taking it back." Clara sat beside the other woman, offering what comfort she could. "Mrs. Henderson, I found something today that might be connected to your case. A pocket watch with the initials MH. But before you tell me what you suspect, I need you to understand that this knowledge puts both of us in danger." Mrs. Henderson nodded, her face pale but determined. "The man who wrote those letters, the man I—" She stopped, shame and fear warring in her expression. It was Marshall Hendricks. He was so kind when Robert was away on business, so understanding about my loneliness. I thought he cared about me, but I realize now that he was gathering information, learning our routines, discovering which families might be vulnerable to pressure. Clara felt the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Marshall Hendricks had used his position and his charm to seduce vulnerable women, gathering intelligence that could be used to manipulate their families' business decisions. When the relationships became inconvenient or the women became resistant to coercion, violence replaced seduction as the preferred tool of control. But Hendricks was supposedly gone, which meant either he was still operating in secret or someone else had taken over his methods and was using his personal effects to deflect suspicion. Either way, Clara now understood that she was dealing with a predator who had refined his techniques over time and was protected by a network of corrupt officials. As Clara walked back to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house in the gathering dusk, she noticed that the same careful footsteps were following her again. This time, she didn't try to lose her pursuer or identify him. Instead, she made sure he could see her clearly, sending a message that she was aware of the surveillance and unafraid to continue her activities despite it. The pocket watch felt heavy in her pocket, not because of its silver weight, but because of the burden of evidence it represented. Clara knew that her investigation had reached a critical point. She had enough information to begin exposing the conspiracy, but she also knew that taking that step would make her a target for people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence to protect their secrets. That night, Clara wrote a detailed letter to her cousin in Denver, including copies of the most important evidence she had gathered. If something happened to her, she wanted someone outside Millfield to know what she had discovered. But even as she sealed the letter, Clara knew that her real protection lay not in escape, but in exposure and shining enough light on the conspiracy that its perpetrators could no longer operate in the shadows. The forged property deed lay buried beneath a stack of legitimate documents in the town clerk's office, but Clara's trained eye for detail caught the subtle differences that marked it as fraudulent. The paper was slightly different in texture, the ink a shade too dark, and most telling of all, the date of the supposed transaction fell exactly 1 week after Sarah Winters's writing accident. Clara had gained access to the clerk's office through her cleaning duties, arriving early in the morning when the building was empty except for herself and the elderly janitor, who barely acknowledged her presence. The office contained the official records of every property transaction in Millfield, and Clara suspected that hidden among the legitimate documents were the papers that would reveal the true purpose behind the attacks on the town's women. What she found exceeded her worst fears. Not only was the Winters property deed forged, but careful examination revealed a pattern of suspicious transactions dating back over 2 years. In each case, valuable mining claims and town lots had been sold for far below market value within weeks of their owners' wives suffering mysterious accidents or illnesses. The buyers were listed as representatives of various investment companies with names like Western Territories Development Corporation and Mountain States Mining Consortium. But the signatures on the paperwork were in the same hand. Someone was using multiple fictitious companies to hide their systematic acquisition of Millfield's most valuable properties. And they were using violence against women to pressure their husbands into making desperate sales. Clara carefully copied the most important details into a small notebook, her hands trembling as she realized the scope of the conspiracy she was uncovering. This wasn't just about attacking individual women. It was about stealing the economic foundation of the entire town through a campaign of terror directed at the families who controlled the most valuable assets. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside made Clara quickly return the documents to their proper places and resume her cleaning duties. When Town Clerk Harrison entered his office, Clara was dusting his desk with the same careful attention she brought to all her work, giving no outward sign of her discoveries. "Morning, Clara," Harrison said with the distracted politeness of a man who had more important things on his mind than acknowledging his cleaning lady. "Don't forget to organize those filing cabinets today. Some important businessmen will be reviewing documents this afternoon." Clara nodded respectfully, but her mind was racing. Harrison's casual mention of visitors suggested that the forged documents weren't just evidence of past crimes. They were active tools in ongoing fraud. Someone would be coming to review paperwork for new property acquisitions, which meant more families were being targeted for the same treatment that had befallen Sarah Winters and Mrs. Henderson. After finishing her duties at the clerk's office, Clara made her way to Marcus's blacksmith shop, where she found her ally working on a set of horseshoes for one of the mine owners. The steady rhythm of his hammer on the anvil provided perfect cover for their conversation, masking their words from any potential eavesdroppers. "Marcus," Clara said, keeping her voice low, "I found evidence of the real motive behind these attacks. It's not just about controlling women. It's about stealing property through fraud and coercion." Marcus set down his hammer and turned to face her, his expression grave. "That makes sense of something I overheard yesterday. Judge Hartwell was talking to Banker Cromwell about accelerating the acquisition timeline and increasing pressure on reluctant sellers. I thought they were just discussing normal business, but now we know they were planning more attacks." Clara finished. "Marcus, I think we're running out of time. Whatever they're planning, it's happening soon, and we still don't have enough evidence to stop them through official channels." Marcus wiped his hands on his leather apron, his face set with determination. "Then maybe it's time to stop worrying about official channels. Sometimes justice has to come from the people when the authorities won't provide it." Clara understood what Marcus was suggesting, but the idea of taking direct action against such powerful enemies terrified her. They were just two people with no official authority, going up against men who controlled the law, the courts, and the economic life of the town. How could they possibly succeed where proper channels had failed? That afternoon brought an answer Clara hadn't expected. As she was cleaning Dr. Blackwell's office, a woman entered whom Clara had never seen before. A well-dressed lady in her 40s with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested education and social standing. Dr. Blackwell greeted her warmly, addressing her as Mrs. Catherine Morrison. Clara's blood chilled as she realized she was looking at Sheriff Morrison's wife, the woman whose medical records had shown a pattern of suspicious injuries that Dr. Blackwell had carefully documented, but never been able to report. Mrs. Morrison's presence in the doctor's office suggested either a routine medical visit or something far more significant. "Doctor," Mrs. Morrison said, her voice cultured but carrying an undercurrent of desperation, "I need to speak with you about my husband's activities. I believe he may be planning something terrible, and I can't remain silent any longer." "Doctor." Blackwell glanced meaningfully at Clara, who continued her cleaning while straining to hear every word of the conversation. If Sheriff Morrison's own wife was willing to speak out against him, it could provide the breakthrough they needed to expose the entire conspiracy. Mrs. Morrison's story unfolded over the next hour, revealing details that confirmed Clara's worst suspicions about the scope of corruption in Millfield. The sheriff's wife had been systematically abused and terrorized into silence, but recent conversations she had overheard suggested that her husband was planning to escalate his campaign of violence against the town's women. He's been meeting with men from outside the territory, Mrs. Morrison said, her voice barely above a whisper. Professional criminals who specialize in what he calls persuasion techniques. They're planning something for the banker's wife. Mrs. Cromwell has been resisting her husband's pressure to sell their property holdings, and they've decided she needs to be convinced more forcefully. Clara felt her heart race as she realized that Mrs. Cromwell was in immediate danger. The conspiracy had moved beyond isolated attacks carried out in secret. They were bringing in outside professionals to systematically terrorize anyone who stood in the way of their property acquisition scheme. Why is this supposed to happen? Dr. Blackwell asked, his professional calm barely concealing his horror at what he was hearing. Tonight, Mrs. Morrison replied, my husband thinks I don't understand his conversations, but I've learned to piece together his plans from fragments of information. They're planning to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, but the real purpose is to break Mrs. Cromwell's will, so she agreed to the property sales her husband wants. Clara exchanged a meaningful look with Dr. Blackwell, understanding that they had reached a crisis point. They had evidence of the conspiracy, but no time to build a legal case or work through official channels. If they were going to save Mrs. Cromwell from the fate that had befallen other women in the town, they would have to act immediately and outside the law. Mrs. Morrison, Dr. Blackwell said carefully, would you be willing to share this information with other people who are working to stop your husband's activities? There are others who have been gathering evidence, and your testimony could be the key to exposing the entire conspiracy. Mrs. Morrison nodded without hesitation. Doctor, I've lived in fear for too long, watching my husband destroy other families while I remain silent. If there's a chance to stop him, I'll do whatever it takes. As Clara left Dr. Blackwell's office that afternoon, her mind was already formulating a plan that would require courage, timing, and a willingness to risk everything on a single night's work. The conspiracy that had seemed so powerful and untouchable was about to face something its perpetrators hadn't counted on ordinary people who had decided that some evils were too great to be endured in silence. The forged property deed in the town clerk's office represented the paper trail of greed and corruption. But Clara understood that stopping the conspiracy would require more than documentation. It would require people willing to stand up against evil, even when the law itself had been corrupted by those who were supposed to uphold it. The wedding ring nestled in the bottom drawer of Sheriff Morrison's desk like a coiled snake, its gold surface catching the lamplight as Clara stared at it in horror. She recognized the distinctive etching around the round. The band she had admired it on Mrs. Henderson's finger during her visits to the house. This was the ring that had gone missing during the attack, the ring that should have been evidence in an investigation, rather than a trophy in the sheriff's private collection. Clara had gained access to Morrison's office through a combination of careful planning and pure desperation. Mrs. Patterson had provided the crucial intelligence. Morrison was attending a town council meeting that evening, and his deputy was making rounds on the other side of town. The window behind the sheriff's desk had a broken latch that Clara had noticed during her cleaning duties at the courthouse, and the darkness of the new moon provided perfect cover for her illegal entry. Her hand shook as she opened each drawer, systematically searching for evidence that would prove Morrison's involvement in the conspiracy. What she found exceeded even her worst expectations. Along with Mrs. Henderson's wedding ring were other trophies, a cameo brooch that had belonged to Sarah Winters, a pearl necklace that Clara remembered seeing Mrs. Cromwell wear to church services. Each item represented not just theft, but a deliberate taking of symbols that defined these women's identities and social standing. But the most damning evidence lay beneath the jewelry in a manila envelope marked insurance. Inside, Clara found detailed plans for each attack, complete with schedules, escape routes, and instructions for staging the scenes to look like accidents or random crimes. The handwriting was Morrison's, but the level of detail suggested extensive planning and coordination with others. More disturbing still were the financial records showing payments from various investment companies, the same fictitious corporations Clara had discovered in the forged property deeds. Morrison wasn't just covering up the conspiracy. He was being paid to orchestrate it, using his authority as sheriff to eliminate obstacles to a systematic theft of the town's most valuable properties. The sound of approaching footsteps made Clara's heart stop. She quickly photographed the most important documents with a small camera Dr. Blackwell had lent her, then returned everything to its original position. But as she prepared to escape through the window, the footsteps stopped directly outside Morrison's office door. Clara pressed herself against the wall beside the window, hardly daring to breathe as she heard the rattle of keys and the creak of the door opening. Morrison's voice filled the small office, along with another voice she didn't immediately recognize. "The Henderson woman is becoming a problem," Morrison said, settling into his chair with the casual confidence of a man who believed his office was secure. "She's been asking too many questions, and that maid of hers has been nosing around where she doesn't belong." The other voice belonged to Judge Hartwell. Clara realized with growing horror the conspiracy reached even higher into the town's power structure than she had suspected. "Then, perhaps it's time to address both problems simultaneously," Hartwell replied coldly. "Make it look like the maid attacked Mrs. Henderson in a robbery attempt gone wrong. Two birds with one stone, and it removes the most troublesome witnesses to our activities." Clara felt ice form in her stomach as she realized they were discussing her murder with the same casual tone they might use to plan a business meeting. But worse than her own danger was the threat to Mrs. Henderson. The woman had already suffered one attack, and now she was being targeted again simply for asking questions about her own assault. "What about the boy?" Morrison asked. "Tommy saw enough to potentially cause problems if he remembers the wrong details." "Children's memories are unreliable," Hartwell said dismissively. "Once his mother is no longer around to encourage his recollections, he'll forget what he thinks he saw. Or, if necessary, arrangements can be made for his education at a distant boarding school." The casual way they discussed destroying a family made Clara understand that she was dealing with men who saw other human beings as obstacles to be removed rather than people deserving of protection. The corruption went beyond simple greed. It reflected a fundamental lack of humanity that made compromise or negotiation impossible. As the two men continued their planning, Clara learned details that revealed the true scope of their operations. The conspiracy involved not just Morrison and Hartwell, but also banker Cromwell, several mine owners, and businessmen from Denver who were financing the systematic acquisition of Millfield's resources. They had been operating for over 3 years, using violence and intimidation to force property sales that had netted them hundreds of thousands of dollars in undervalued assets. Most shocking of all was the revelation that Marshall Hendricks hadn't left town voluntarily. He had discovered their activities and been murdered for his interference. His body lay in an abandoned mine shaft 10 miles outside town, and his personal effects were being used to plant false evidence that would implicate him in the crimes Morrison and his associates were committing. The federal marshal arrives next week for his annual inspection, Hartwell said. "We need to wrap up the remaining acquisitions and eliminate any potential witnesses before then. Once we control the majority of the mining claims in the area, we can afford to be more selective about our methods." Clara understood that she was listening to the final phase of a conspiracy that had been years in the making. They weren't planning to continue their activities indefinitely. They were preparing for one last surge of violence that would eliminate all obstacles and secure their control over the town's economic future. When the two men finally left the office, Clara waited Another 10 minutes before climbing through the window and making her escape. But as she made her way through the dark streets toward Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, she realized that her situation had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just investigating a conspiracy. She was a marked woman whose death had been planned and approved by the very people who were supposed to protect her. The wedding ring had been more than just evidence of Morrison's guilt. It was proof that the sheriff saw his victims as trophies rather than human beings, objects to be collected and displayed rather than people whose suffering mattered. But Clara also understood that the ring represented something else, a connection between all the women who had suffered at the hands of these men, a symbol of their shared victimization and their common need for justice. Back in her small room, Clara spread out all the evidence she had gathered over the past weeks. Dr. Blackwell's medical records, the forged property deeds, the pocket watch, and now her documented proof of Morrison's involvement in planning and executing the attacks. Together, these pieces formed a picture of systematic corruption and violence that demanded immediate action. But Clara also knew the traditional channels of justice had been compromised. With Morrison controlling law enforcement in Hartwell, controlling the courts, there was no official avenue for exposing their crimes. The federal marshal's impending arrival offered some hope, but Clara understood that she and Mrs. Henderson would likely be dead long before any federal intervention could take place. As she prepared for bed, Clara made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. She would not wait for someone else to save them. She would not hope that authorities would eventually see through the corruption and act on behalf of the victims. Instead, she would take direct action to protect the people these men planned to harm, even if it meant putting her own life at greater risk. The wedding ring hidden in Morrison's desk represented the sheriff's arrogance and sense of impunity. But it also represented something else, evidence that could be used against him if Clara could figure out how to make it public in a way that couldn't be suppressed or explained away. Tomorrow, she would begin the most dangerous phase of her investigation, moving from gathering evidence to actively disrupting the conspiracy's plans. Clara said her prayers that night with her mother's worn Bible, asking for strength and wisdom for the trials ahead. But for the first time since this ordeal began, she felt a sense of clarity about her purpose. She was no longer just trying to survive or to protect herself. She was fighting for every woman who had been victimized by these men, and for every family that would be targeted if their reign of terror continued unchecked. The military medal felt warm in Clara's palm as Tommy pressed it into her hand, his young face serious with the weight of the trust he was placing in her. The Bronze Star had belonged to his father's brother, killed in the war between the states, and it represented everything honorable about the Henderson family's heritage. But for Clara, it symbolized something even more important: the courage to stand up against overwhelming odds when doing what's right matters more than personal safety. Uncle James won the medal at Gettysburg, Tommy explained, his voice carrying the reverence of a child who had heard the story many times. Papa says he charged up a hill, even though he knew he probably wouldn't come back down. He did it because other people needed him to be brave. Clara understood why Tommy was giving her this treasured family heirloom. The boy had overheard enough conversations between Clara and his mother to understand that she was planning something dangerous, something that might require the kind of courage his uncle had shown on a Pennsylvania battlefield 24 years earlier. "Tommy," Clara said gently, "I can't take something this precious to your family." "Please," the boy insisted, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mama said you're trying to protect us from the bad men, just like Uncle James protected his friends in the war. I want you to have something to remember, that being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave." Clara's throat tightened with emotion as she accepted the medal, understanding that Tommy was giving her more than a family treasure. He was offering her the spiritual strength of generations of people who had chosen to do what was right regardless of the cost. She tucked the medal into her pocket next to her mother's prayer book, feeling the weight of both objects as tangible reminders of the values that had guided her to this moment. The plan Clara had developed over the past 2 days was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. She would use herself as bait to draw the conspirators into a confrontation where their crimes could be witnessed by people they couldn't intimidate or silence. The arrival of the federal marshal provided the perfect opportunity, if Clara could orchestrate events so that the marshal witnessed the conspiracy's violence firsthand. No amount of local corruption could suppress the truth that Mrs. Patterson's boarding house had become the unofficial headquarters for their resistance movement. Dr. Blackwell arrived first, carrying his medical bag and his private journal documenting years of suspicious injuries. Marcus followed shortly after, his blacksmith's tools cleaned and ready for whatever role he might need to play in the evening's events. Mrs. Morrison came last, her face pale but determined as she prepared to testify against her own husband. The federal marshal checked into the hotel this afternoon, Mrs. Patterson reported, consulting her careful notes. His name is Samuel Cross, and he's got a reputation for being incorruptible. More importantly, he's got jurisdiction that supersedes local authority, so Morrison can't simply have him arrested or run out of town. Clara spread out a hand-drawn map of Millfield on the kitchen table, marking the locations that would be crucial to their plan. Morrison and his men are planning to attack Mrs. Cromwell tonight, probably around midnight when the streets are empty. They'll stage it to look like a robbery, but the real purpose is to terrorize her into agreeing to property sales. Dr. Blackwell studied the map with the analytical mind he brought to medical diagnoses. If we can position Marshal Cross where he can witness the attack, he'll have no choice but to act. But Clara, this plan puts you in tremendous danger. You'll be completely exposed until the marshal can intervene. I've been in danger since the moment I decided to help Tommy, Clara replied. At least this way, the danger serves a purpose. If we don't stop them tonight, they'll eliminate Mrs. Cromwell, probably Mrs. Henderson, and definitely me. Our only chance is to force a confrontation on our terms. Marcus leaned forward, his powerful hands clenched into fists. What about the rest of us? We can't just let you face them alone. Clara had anticipated this objection and had prepared her response carefully. You'll each have specific roles to play, but you have to stay hidden until the right moment. If they see all of us together, they'll know it's a trap and adjust their plans accordingly. The whole scheme depends on them believing they're in complete control until it's too late for them to retreat. Mrs. Morrison spoke up, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. What about my husband's suspicions? He's been watching me more carefully lately, and if I disappear for too long tonight, he'll know something is wrong. You won't disappear, Clara assured her. Your job is to be exactly where he expects you to be at home, apparently unaware of his activities. But you'll have witnesses hidden nearby who can testify that you tried to warn the authorities about his plans. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the back door. Mrs. Patterson opened it to reveal Sarah, the mixed-race woman who ran another boarding house on the edge of town. Sarah's establishment catered to travelers and temporary workers, making it the perfect place to gather information about strangers and suspicious activities. The men from Denver checked out of my place this afternoon, Sarah reported without preamble. But they didn't leave town. They moved to a camp about 2 miles outside Millfield, near the old Hendricks mine. They've got enough supplies for several days, which suggests they're planning more than just tonight's work. This information added another layer of urgency to their situation. The professional criminals Morrison had hired weren't planning a single attack. They were preparing for an extended campaign of violence that would continue until all resistance to the property acquisition scheme had been eliminated. Clara felt the weight of Tommy's uncle's medal in her pocket as she considered the implications of Sarah's report. How many men are we talking about? At least 4, possibly 6. They're well armed, and they move like they know what they're doing. These aren't just local toughs. They're experienced killers who've done this kind of work before. Dr. Blackwell's face grew grim as he processed this information. Clara, if you're facing that many professionals, even with the marshal's intervention, you might not survive long enough for help to arrive. Clara understood the doctor's concern, but she also knew that backing down now would mean condemning not just herself, but all the women these men planned to target. Then, we'll have to make sure the marshal understands exactly what he's walking into. Dr. Blackwell, I need you to approach him directly and share your medical evidence. Don't mention our specific plan, but make sure he understands that lives are in immediate danger. The doctor nodded grimly. I can do that. Cross has a reputation for listening to evidence rather than local politics. If I can show him the pattern of injuries and the forged documents, he'll understand that something systematic is happening here. Marcus stood up from the table, his face set with determination. What about weapons? If we're going up against professional killers, we need more than courage and good intentions. Clara had considered this question carefully, understanding that their confrontation might well turn violent regardless of their intentions to avoid bloodshed. Mrs. Patterson, didn't you mention that your late husband left some things in the basement? The older woman nodded knowingly. Henry was a careful man who believed in being prepared for trouble. I think you'll find what you need down there. As the group prepared to separate and take their positions for the night's work, Clara felt a profound sense of gratitude for the allies who had chosen to stand with her. None of them had asked for this fight, but each had decided that some evils were too great to be endured in silence. Mrs. Morrison was the first to leave, returning to her house where she would maintain the pretense of normalcy while secretly documenting her husband's activities. Dr. Blackwell followed, carrying the evidence that would hopefully convince Marshal Cross to take immediate action. Marcus and Sarah took positions near the Cromwell house, where they could observe the planned attack and summon help if Clara's plan went awry. Alone in Mrs. Patterson's kitchen, Clara made her final preparations. She wrote a letter to her cousin in Denver, explaining everything she had discovered and providing instructions for what to do if she didn't survive the night. She checked the small pistol Mrs. Patterson had provided, ensuring it was loaded and functional despite her hope that she wouldn't need to use it. Most importantly, she spent time with her mother's prayer book and Tommy's uncle's medal, drawing strength from the faith and courage of those who had faced their own impossible odds and chosen to do what was right regardless of the consequences. As midnight approached, Clara made her way through the dark streets toward the confrontation that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of every family in Millfield who had fallen victim to the conspiracy's greed and violence. The medal in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, reminding her that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act in spite of fear when other people's lives depended on your choices. Behind her, the lights of Millfield flickered in the darkness like stars, each one representing families who deserved to live without the threat of violence and corruption hanging over their daily lives. Whatever happened in the next few hours, Clara knew she had chosen the only path that would allow her to live with herself if she survived to see another dawn. The small silver thimble had been Clara's mother's most precious possession, not because of its monetary value, but because it represented the countless hours of careful needlework that had kept their family clothed and fed during the hardest years after emancipation. Clara pressed it between her fingers as she waited in the shadows near the Cromwell house, drawing strength from the memory of her mother's patient hands, creating beauty and utility from scraps of fabric. Her mother had always said that a thimble was like courage, something small and seemingly insignificant that protected you while you did the work that needed doing. Tonight, Clara understood exactly what she had meant. The conspiracy's hired killers were already in position around the Cromwell property, professional shapes moving with deadly purpose through the darkness, but Clara felt her mother's presence. in the warm metal against her palm. The abandoned mine shaft where Clara had positioned herself provided perfect concealment while offering clear sight lines to the Cromwell house and the surrounding streets. She had chosen this location carefully, knowing that it would force Morrison's men to expose themselves as they approached their target. More importantly, it was close enough to the main road that Marshal Cross would be able to witness everything when Dr. Blackwell brought him to investigate reports of suspicious activity in the area. Clara checked her pocket watch. 11:47 p.m. In 30 minutes, if her intelligence was correct, Morrison's hired killers would begin their assault on the Cromwell house. The plan was to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, with Mrs. Cromwell suffering just enough violence to break her resistance to her husband's business dealings without causing permanent injury that might attract unwanted attention. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Clara's pulse quicken. Marshal Cross was riding toward the area, guided by Dr. Blackwell, who had convinced the federal officer that immediate intervention was necessary to prevent a serious crime. Clara could see them in the distance, two riders moving with urgent purpose through the moonlit streets. But something was wrong. Instead of the 4 or 6 men Sarah had reported seeing at the camp, Clara counted at least 8 figures moving into position around the Cromwell house. Morrison had brought additional reinforcements, suggesting that this attack was intended to be more than just intimidation. They were planning to eliminate Mrs. Cromwell and stage it as a tragic accident that would remove all obstacles to their property acquisition scheme. Clara felt her blood chill as she realized the implications. If Mrs. Cromwell was murdered tonight, the message to other potential resistors would be unmistakably clear. No one could oppose the conspiracy's plans and expect to survive. The reign of terror that had claimed individual victims would escalate into wholesale slaughter of anyone who stood in the way of their greed. The first gunshot shattered the night's silence at exactly midnight, followed immediately by the crash of breaking glass and Mrs. Cromwell's terrified screams. Clara could see muzzle flashes in the windows of the house as the attackers poured through doors and windows with military precision. These weren't the actions of ordinary criminals. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of soldiers executing a planned assault. Marshal Cross and Dr. Blackwell were still 2 blocks away, too far to intervene before the violence escalated beyond any hope of saving Mrs. Cromwell's life. Clara realized with crystalline clarity that her carefully planned trap had failed. The marshal wouldn't arrive in time to witness Morrison's crimes, and an innocent woman would die while Clara watched helplessly from the shadows. The thimble seemed to grow warm in her palm as Clara made the decision that would define the rest of her life. Instead of waiting for rescue that might come too late, she would create the distraction that would give Mrs. Cromwell a chance to survive and ensure that Marshal Cross arrived to find evidence that couldn't be denied or explained away. Clara emerged from her hiding place and began running toward the Cromwell house, a voice cutting through the night as she shouted warnings and identification of the attackers. Sheriff Morrison's men are attacking the house. Murder! Help! Federal Marshal, they're committing murder. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The coordinated assault faltered as the attackers realized their carefully planned operation had been compromised. Several figures broke off from the attack to pursue Clara, their professional discipline overridden by the immediate need to eliminate the witness who could identify them and their employer. Clara ran with the desperate speed of someone whose life depended on staying ahead of pursuers who wouldn't hesitate to kill her the moment she stumbled or slowed. Behind her, she could hear the pounding of boots on hard-packed earth and the harsh breathing of men accustomed to violence. But she also heard something else, the thunder of hoofbeats as Marshal Cross spurred his horse toward the sounds of gunfire and Clara's desperate cries for help. The first bullet whistled past Clara's ear as she dove behind a water trough outside the general store, splinters of wood exploding from the planking where the slug had struck. She could hear her pursuers spreading out, trying to flank her position and eliminate the angles where she might find cover. "There's nowhere to run, girl," one of them called out, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man who had done this kind of work many times before. "Make it easy on yourself and come out where we can see you." Clara pressed herself against the rough wood of the trough, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain her enemies could hear it. The thimble in her palm had grown slick with perspiration, but she held onto it like a talisman, remembering her mother's words about courage, being something small that protected you while you did important work. The sound of Marshal Cross's voice cut through the night like a sword blade, carrying the absolute authority of federal law enforcement. "This is United States Marshal Samuel Cross. Throw down your weapons and surrender immediately." Clara heard the sharp crack of the marshal's rifle, followed by a cry of pain from one of her pursuers. The professional killers had suddenly found themselves facing someone with training and equipment equal to their own, and their tactical advantage had evaporated in an instant. But Clara's moment of relief was short-lived. She could hear movement in the darkness around her position, and she realized that at least two of the attackers were still trying to reach her while their companions engaged the marshal. These men understood that Clara was the key witness who could expose their entire operation, and they were willing to risk everything to silence her permanently. The next few minutes would determine whether Clara's desperate gambit had saved Mrs. Cromwell's life and exposed the conspiracy, or whether it had simply provided Morrison's hired killers with 2 additional victims to add to their growing list of eliminated obstacles. Clara clutched her mother's thimble and whispered a prayer for strength, knowing that the small piece of silver in her hand carried with it the hopes and dreams of everyone who had ever been told they were too insignificant to matter. In the distance, she could hear more gunfire and shouting as Marshal Cross's intervention turned what should have been a simple assassination into a running battle through the streets of Millfield. The conspiracy's careful plans were unraveling in spectacular fashion, but Clara understood that her own survival was far from guaranteed. The men hunting her in the darkness were professionals who wouldn't give up easily, and she was running out of places to hide. The town charter felt like salvation in Clara's trembling hands as she burst through the doors of the courthouse, the heavy document clutched against her chest like a shield. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit echoed through the night as Morrison's hired killers closed the distance, their boots pounding against the wooden sidewalks with deadly determination. But ahead of her lay the one place in Millfield where the truth might still have power, the courtroom where justice was supposed to be administered, even if it had been corrupted by the very men she was fighting. Clara had reached the courthouse through a combination of desperate courage and pure luck. When her position behind the water trough became untenable, she had sprinted toward the town center, hoping to reach a place where witnesses and official authority might protect her from assassination. Marshal Cross's intervention had disrupted the attackers' coordination, but it hadn't eliminated the threat. If anything, the federal marshal's presence had made Clara's survival even more critical to the conspiracy's plans. The courthouse doors slammed shut behind her just as the first of her pursuers reached the building's front steps. Clara threw the heavy iron bolt that secured the entrance, buying herself precious seconds while she searched for the evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy to public scrutiny. The town charter wasn't just a historical document. It contained the legal framework that governed property transfers and business operations in Millfield, and Clara knew that comparing its requirements to the forged deeds would prove fraud in terms that even corrupt officials couldn't dispute. "Open the door, girl." The voice from outside carried absolute menace, the tone of someone accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. "You're only making this harder on yourself." Clara ignored the threats as she rummaged through the courthouse's filing cabinets, searching for the original charter documents and the property records that would provide irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy's activities. Her hand shook as she pulled out folder after folder, but her mother's thimble remained warm in her palm, reminding her that courage meant continuing to work even when fear threatened to overwhelm her. The crash of breaking glass announced that her pursuers had found another way into the building. Clara could hear them moving through the courthouse's corridors, systematically searching for her while calling out warnings and threats designed to break her nerve. But she also heard something else, voices and footsteps from multiple directions, suggesting that the commotion had attracted attention from other people in town. "Clara, Clara, where are you?" Marcus's voice echoed through the building, and Clara felt a surge of hope as she realized her allies had followed the sounds of conflict to the courthouse. Dr. Blackwell's voice joined Marcus's, along with others. Clara didn't immediately recognize townspeople who had been awakened by the gunfire and had come to investigate the disturbance. "I'm in the records room," Clara called back, her voice carrying across the courthouse's high-ceilinged chambers. "I have the evidence. The town charter and the property deeds, they prove everything." The response was immediate and explosive. Gunfire erupted throughout the building as Morrison's hired killers found themselves facing not just Clara, but a growing number of townspeople who were beginning to understand what was happening in their community. The professional assassins who had been so confident when stalking a single woman suddenly faced the prospect of fighting an entire aroused citizenry. Marshal Cross's voice cut through the chaos with the authority of federal law. "This is a federal investigation. All civilians take cover while we secure the building." Clara heard the marshal's boots on the courthouse stairs, accompanied by what sounded like at least 2 deputies, who had apparently been summoned from the territorial capital. The next few minutes passed in a blur of shouting, gunfire, and confused movement as the courthouse became a battlefield between Morrison's conspirators and the forces of legitimate law enforcement. Clara remained in the records room, using the time to gather every piece of evidence she could find while the conflict raged around her. When the shooting finally stopped, Clara emerged from the records room to find Marshal Cross standing in the courthouse's main chamber, his rifle trained on 3 captured men while Dr. Blackwell tended to wounded townspeople. Marcus stood guard over a 4th prisoner, his blacksmith's hammer replaced by a shotgun that looked entirely natural in his capable hands. "Miss Washington," Marshal Cross said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and amazement, "I understand you've been conducting an investigation into criminal activities in this community. Would you be willing to share your findings with federal authorities?" Clara spread the documents across the judge's bench, her hands steady now that the immediate danger had passed. The town charter lay at the center of the display, surrounded by forged deeds, Dr. Blackwell's medical records, and copies of the evidence she had gathered from Morrison's office. Together, they formed a comprehensive picture of corruption and violence that even the most skeptical observer would have to acknowledge. "Marshal," Clara said, her voice clear and confident, "these documents prove that Sheriff Morrison and his associates have been using violence against women to coerce property sales and defraud the citizens of Millfield. They've murdered at least 1 person and terrorized dozens of others in pursuit of illegal profits." As Clara explained her evidence, a crowd gathered in the courthouse. Word of the night's events had spread throughout the town, and people came to see for themselves what had been happening in their community. Mrs. Henderson arrived with Tommy, both of them pale but determined to see justice done. Mrs. Cromwell appeared, shaken but alive, her survival a testament to Clara's intervention. Most significantly, Mrs. Morrison entered the courthouse, no longer hiding her bruises or cowering in fear of her husband's violence. She carried with her a suitcase full of documents and personal items that would provide additional evidence of the sheriff's criminal activities. "Marshal Cross," Mrs. Morrison said, her voice steady despite the trauma she had endured, "my husband has been systematically abusing his authority for years. I have evidence of bribery, fraud, and conspiracy that involves multiple officials in this community. The federal marshal's investigation continued through the night and into the following. They, as witness after witness, came forward to share their experiences with the conspiracy's activities. The carefully constructed facade of respectability that had protected Morrison and his associates crumbled under the weight of evidence and testimony that could no longer be suppressed or explained away. Clara found herself at the center of it all, no longer the invisible servant who cleaned houses and minded her own business, but a key witness whose courage had exposed a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of Millfield's power structure. The town charter that had seemed like just another dusty document had become the legal foundation for dismantling a conspiracy that had terrorized the community for years. As dawn broke over Millfield, Clara stood on the courthouse steps watching. As Morrison and his surviving associates were loaded into a federal prison wagon for transport to the territorial capital, the sheriff who had seemed so powerful and untouchable just days earlier now looked like what he had always been, a criminal who had hidden behind a badge while preying on the people he was sworn to protect. Tommy Henderson ran up to Clara, his young face bright with relief and admiration. "Miss Clara, you did it. You stopped the bad men just like Uncle James stopped the enemy soldiers." Clara smiled as she returned the boy's uncle's medal, understanding that she had learned something important about courage that night. It wasn't the absence of fear that made someone brave. It was the willingness to act, in spite of fear, when other people's lives depended on your choices. And sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption and violence wasn't a gun or a badge. It was the truth, wielded by someone who refused to be silenced by threats or intimidation. 6 months later, Clara stood before the small schoolhouse she had built with her own hands and the generous support of a community that had learned to see her as more than just a servant. The teaching certificate in her pocket bore the official seal of the Montana Territory, but it represented something far more significant than professional qualification. It was proof that courage could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the one-room schoolhouse, illuminating rows of desks where children of all backgrounds would soon gather to learn their letters and numbers. Tommy Henderson sat in the front row, his serious young face bright with excitement as he helped. Clara arranged the primers and slates that would be used by students whose parents had once believed education was beyond their reach. "Miss Clara," Tommy said, holding up a McGuffey reader with careful reverence, "do you really think all the children will want to come to school together? Even the ones whose parents work in the mines?" Clara smiled as she adjusted the small American flag that hung beside her desk, remembering when such a question would have seemed impossible to imagine, let alone answer with confidence. "Tommy, one of the most important things I've learned is that people are usually much better than the worst things they've been taught to believe about each other. When children learn together, they discover that friendship doesn't depend on the color of their skin or how much money their families have." The schoolhouse itself stood as testament to how much Millfield had changed since the night Clara exposed the conspiracy that had terrorized the town for years. Built on land donated by Mrs. Henderson and funded by collections from families of all backgrounds, it represented a community's commitment to ensuring that the next generation would be better educated and more united than their parents had been. Dr. Blackwell entered the schoolhouse carrying a box of medical supplies, his contribution to Clara's plan to provide basic health education along with traditional academic subjects. The doctor had become one of Clara's strongest supporters, using his professional standing to advocate for changes that would have been unthinkable before the conspiracy's exposure. "Good morning, Clara," Dr. Blackwell said, setting the medical supplies on a shelf beside the teaching materials. "The Territorial Education Commissioner was quite impressed with your curriculum proposals. He said he'd never seen such a comprehensive plan for integrating practical skills with academic learning." Clara felt a warm glow of pride as she remembered The long hours she had spent developing lesson plans that would prepare her students not just for reading and arithmetic, but for the practical challenges of life in a frontier community. Her own experience had taught her that education meant more than book learning. It meant developing the confidence and critical thinking, skills that would help people stand up for themselves and their neighbors when circumstances demanded courage. Marcus Thompson arrived shortly after Dr. Blackwell, carrying the small desk he had crafted for Clara's use. The blacksmith had become more than just an ally in their fight against corruption. He had become someone whose company Clara genuinely treasured, whose quiet wisdom and steadfast character had helped her navigate the challenges of her new role in the community. This should be sturdy enough for all the grading and lesson planning you'll be doing, Marcus said as he positioned the desk near the window where Clara would have good light for her work. And I made the drawers deep enough to hold all those books you've been collecting. The books Marcus referenced represented one of Clara's greatest treasures volumes, donated by families throughout Millfield and beyond, creating a library that would serve not just the school, but the entire community. Mrs. Patterson had contributed novels and poetry collections. Dr. Blackwell had provided medical and scientific texts. And even families of modest means had found books to share with their neighbors' children. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, carrying a fresh-baked apple pie that filled the schoolhouse with the warm sense of cinnamon and home. The woman who had once been terrorized into silence had become one of Clara's most effective advocates, using her social position to convince other prominent families that integrated education would benefit everyone in the community. "Clara, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, setting the pie on Clara's new desk, "the Ladies' Auxiliary wanted you to know that we've raised enough money to purchase slate boards for every student, regardless of their family's ability to pay. No child will go without the tools they need to learn." This generosity represented more than just financial support. It reflected a fundamental shift in how the community understood its responsibilities to all its members. The conspiracy's exposure had forced Millfield citizens to confront uncomfortable truths about inequality and exploitation, and many had chosen to respond by working to ensure such abuses could never happen again. Sarah Patterson, now an official school board member despite the unofficial nature of her authority, entered carrying the attendance ledger that would track each student's progress. The mixed-race woman who had once operated on the margins of Millfield society now served as businesswoman who had once operated on the margins of Millfield society now served as society now served as business, a bridge between different communities, helping to ensure that all families felt welcome in the new educational system. "We have 23 students enrolled for the first term," Sarah reported, consulting her careful records. 12 from the mining families, 6 from the business district, 3 from the ranching community outside town, and 2 from the hotel and boarding house workers. The youngest is 5. The oldest is 14. Clara marveled at these numbers, understanding that they represented not just an educational opportunity, but a social transformation. For the first time in Millfield's history, children from all backgrounds would learn together, forming friendships and understanding that would help prevent the kind of divisions that had allowed corruption to flourish in previous years. As her friends and supporters prepared to leave Clara alone with her final preparations, Mrs. Morrison appeared in the schoolhouse doorway. The sheriff's former wife had endured months of testimony and legal proceedings as her husband's crimes were fully investigated and prosecuted, but she had emerged from the ordeal with a quiet strength that impressed everyone who knew her story. "Clara," Mrs. Morrison said, her voice carrying gratitude that had deepened over the months since that terrible night at the courthouse, "I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done. Not just for stopping my husband's crimes, but for showing all of us that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they're willing to act on their principles." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she embraced the woman whose courage in speaking out had been crucial to exposing the full scope of the conspiracy. "Mrs. Morrison, you've shown just as much bravery as anyone. It takes tremendous strength to stand up against someone who has power over your daily life." After her visitors departed, Clara spent the remaining hour before her students' arrival arranging and rearranging her classroom, making sure everything was perfect for the beginning of what she hoped would be a long and rewarding career in education. Her mother's prayer book sat on her desk beside the teaching materials, a reminder of the faith and determination that had carried her through the darkest moments of her investigation. At precisely 9 o'clock, the first students began arriving at the schoolhouse. They came slowly at first, uncertain about this new experience, but their natural curiosity quickly overcame their initial shyness. Clara watched as children, who had never spoken to each other, began making tentative friendships, drawn together by the excitement of learning and the novelty of their integrated classroom. Tommy Henderson took his role as unofficial assistant teacher seriously, helping the younger children find their seats and showing them how to hold their slates properly. His easy confidence with students from all backgrounds reflected the changes that had taken place in his own family, where conversations about justice and equality had replaced the fearful silence that had once dominated their home. As Clara called her first class to order and began the lesson that would mark the beginning of her teaching career, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months earlier, she had been an invisible servant whose primary concern was simply surviving in a world that saw her as less than human. Today, she stood before a classroom of eager students as a respected member of her community, someone whose voice carried weight and whose opinions mattered to her neighbors. Transformation hadn't been easy or automatic. Clara had faced skepticism from some families who questioned whether a former maid was qualified to teach their children, and she had worked harder than ever to prove herself worthy of their trust. But the support of allies like Dr. Blackwell and Mrs. Henderson had helped her overcome doubts and obstacles, and her own dedication to excellence had gradually won over even her harshest critics. "Good morning, students," Clara said, her voice carrying across the small schoolhouse with confidence and warmth. "Welcome to the first day of what I hope will be a wonderful year of learning and discovery. We're going to study reading, writing, arithmetic, and science. But we're also going to learn about something equally important: how to be good neighbors and citizens who look out for each other." As Clara began her first lesson, explaining the rules and expectations that would govern their classroom community, she touched the small thimble in her pocket, the same thimble that had given her courage during the darkest moments of her investigation. Her mother had been right about courage being something small that protected you while you did important work. But Clara had learned that courage was also something that grew stronger when it was shared, something that could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities when people were willing to stand together for what was right. Outside the schoolhouse windows, Millfield went about its daily business under new leadership that prioritized transparency and accountability over personal profit. Federal oversight had cleaned up the corruption that had plagued local government, and citizen committees now monitored official activities to ensure such abuses could never again take root in their community. The mining claims that had been fraudulently obtained were being returned to their rightful owners, and the investment companies that had profited from the conspiracy were facing federal prosecution. More importantly, the culture of fear and intimidation that had kept people silent about injustice had been replaced by a growing awareness that ordinary citizens had both the right and the responsibility to hold their leaders accountable. As her first day of teaching drew to a close and her students prepared to head home, Clara felt a profound sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with service to others. She had found her calling in education, but more than that, she had discovered that her mother's faith in the power of courage and determination had been absolutely correct. the prayer book that had sustained Clara through her investigation now sat on her teacher's desk as a reminder that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the personal cost, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice was simply refusing to be silent when silence would perpetuate harm to others. Clara Washington, former servant and current teacher, locked the door of her schoolhouse and walked home, through streets where she was greeted with respect and affection by neighbors, who had learned to see her not as someone to be ignored or dismissed, but as a vital member of their community whose courage had made all their lives better. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve. But tonight, Clara would give thanks for the journey that had led her from invisibility to influence, from fear to courage, and from survival to purpose.